Hey there, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, we're back with another Hoser video, and last week he put out a video that caught my attention, and I really wanted to hear his take on it. It is called, Why Hasn't Communist Cuba Collapsed Yet? Right? Doesn't communism fail in every attempt? You know the famous saying. All right, we'll see what he has to say. Hope to get a chance to add some context, especially with the Cuba situation. Original video, link down below. Make sure you're supporting Hoser. They've been awesome to me. Hey, when you're done with this, come check out one of my original content videos on my other channel. Our alternate history series has really been doing well. You might especially like that. All right, let's check this out. I think it's important that any talk about the communist era of Cuba brings in the discussion of what went on before the Cuban Revolution, what was going on in Cuba, you know, thinking about the causes of that, why that revolution took place. And it usually makes the story a lot clearer as to how this could happen and how it continues to exist in its form, with whatever pros and cons you want to say Cuba has experienced.
This accomplishment of the Communist Party of Cuba is existing in the modern day.
That's fair.
Outliving Yugoslavia, the Berlin Wall, the Khmer Rouge,
True.
the Eastern European system, any practical sense of communism in China and Vietnam, and yeah, the Soviet Union. And it did.
Yep, y'all come to terms yet that China is not communist? They've never achieved such thing. May still end up being the goal, which is what communism is. It's an end goal, not necessarily an institution or even a system, but achieving a moneyless, stateless, classless society, if you want to go by those parameters, which it doesn't look like China is even attempting to necessarily become a like moneyless society or stateless. Classless? Oh, maybe.
In China and Vietnam, and yeah, the Soviet Union. And it did this while its capital was only 100 miles away from communism's biggest hater.
And multiple attempts to take out the regime. That is true. Pretty resilient. All right, plenty of L's for Cuba. Thinking about refugees that have left Cuba.
Meanwhile, just across on the Floridian tip, a thriving Cuban community grew to be the engine of South Florida, propelling Miami to be dubbed the capital of Latin America. I think you can make a case that Cuba's communist...
That's an interesting thing. The capital of Latin America. I mean, there's no such thing. I mean, I guess it's metaphorical in a sense. Very anti-communist sentiment, though, amongst the Cubans of South Florida. Obviously, because they fled it or were enemies of the regime in some way. Or there's famous anti-communist Cuban Americans, say like Ted Cruz, whose family actually had to flee during the Batista regime that came before the Cuban Revolution, in which the Cuban Revolution was in response to.
The party survived not in spite of being so close to the U.S., but because of it. And you can make a case that South Florida has thrived
even with embargoes,
in spite of the Castro regime,
trade
but
embargoes,
also partly because of it. The two regions have a weird symbiotic relationship with each other, keeping one Cuba as an orthodox Marxist state and the other Cuba as, well, Vice City.
Havana.
Part 356 of how much I make as a bottle girl in, I always say Miami, but it's really Fort Lauderdale.
But when Cuba was first independent, it was nowhere near communist. It was democratic, sure, but its politics was dominated by strongmen, and it was a market economy, sure, but independent, it was nowhere near communist. But when Cuba was first independent, it was nowhere near communist.
Oh, yeah.
It was democratic, sure, but its politics was dominated by strongmen.
Well, and essentially puppets of the United States ever since the end of the Spanish-American War.
And it was a market economy, sure, but that market was dominated, like most ex-Spanish colonies, by a handful of wealthy land-owning families which got rich off of Cuba's historical cash crop, sugar.
Slave labor. Yep. Aristocracy. That's what it transferred to. Went from a colony straight to an aristocracy, which will then collaborate with Western nations at this time, like the United States, who will oversee its political leadership till it gets overthrown.
To not be dependent on after a sugar shock, so you could tell what type of dogs he hung around. The country was a hub of what Miami is a hub of now: clubs, beaches, casinos, brothels, and especially during Prohibition, alcohol. Basically,
I think about that during Prohibition
for American tourists.
That's right. You've just perfect place to go to get your drink on during the Prohibition, huh? Hop on some boats from southern Florida. I mean, some of it's only like 90 miles away.
The ex-president Fulgencio Batista, beautiful women were his solution to save the economy after a sugar shock. So you could tell what type of dogs he hung around.
He's the guy that the U.S. is going to prop up. He's going to be a dictator.
His government grew to be so unpopular that it's played a massive role in keeping the current Cuban regime alive. Maybe it was because he kept his face around for 25 years and the people just got sick of him, but it's more likely that it was the murder, torture, secret police, and suspension of democracy.
Right.
He faced 2 groups of organized resistance during his dictator phase.
Gotta say, I'm very, very thankful that he added the context that leads to the communist state of Cuba. Easiest thing to do that people usually do is compare states today with other modern states. And a conversation that has to be talked about when you are doing any kind of comparisons of states is what was that state like before, using its own history, comparing it to its own history, rather than just paralleling with other countries. Because what goes on in another country is not going to have an effect on this country. They're on their own trajectory. Unless somebody intervenes, which is exactly what happened in Cuba.
One was a principled Marxist-Leninist group, the PSP, which would take Cuba by storm through books and speeches and pamphlets. Nerds. The other was a revolutionary party, kind of just for the sake of revolution. It wasn't Marx which inspired these guys, but Jose Marti, a poet who played a key role in gearing Cuba towards independence from the Spanish and setting it apart from the U.S.
Understand the context here, too, of Latin American independence from once it was colonies, before, like the Spanish. Now you're going into the 1900s, and sometimes it's independence from your own government.
This sect was led by a young Fidel Castro.
Yeah.
A letter to President Roosevelt asking to see a $10 bill because he'd never seen one before. Ironically, he also invited the U.S. government to come check out Cuba's iron supply and take some if they're running low. They sent the letter back, but with no $10 bill. And I like to think this is when Fidel got radicalized against the U.S. government and imperialism.
Kind of interesting. You know what this story made me think of was Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, who was like, yo, America, writing to the president, our story's kind of like yours. We want independence. Like, we should be on the same side, right? And then just like, nah, you're communist. Sorry. Your independence does not supersede your communism. And what those two were doing as well is like the end goal was independence. The vehicle and the transition was going to be a socialist state that they believed needed to be the transition to the people as response to the current makeup of who owns really anything. And in Vietnam, as well as with Cuba, there was landholding elites, especially from Vietnam when you were talking about like French colonists and then the Japanese taking over. Their answer to what happens to the resources and the means of production in Cuba or Vietnam was socialism. But with, goal number 1, independence. But can't use the C word, man. Not if you want to talk to the Americans.
But the truth is that Cubans were never too fond of Americans, even before the revolution.
They supported Batista.
According to communism historian Archie Brown, anti-Americanism was stronger in Cuba than anywhere else in Latin America.
Because of the support of Batista.
Fidel then went to university and got really, really into politics, going on to lead a group of opponents to the Batista regime by attempting to storm the Moncada fortress.
Yeah, he was essentially a puppet of the United States, or at least was a major collaborator with the U.S. The U.S. had all kinds of economic investments into Cuba, not something that the people of Cuba necessarily wanted, because the profits and the benefits that come that should come from that, specifically with natural resources, was not being appreciated or, given to the Cuban people. Plus the fact that you had Batista, who was, a dictator in all senses of the term. So the U.S. by connection is going to be part of that angst.
Where many in his group were hunted down, jailed, or killed. He escaped, though, starting a life of what is perhaps the most time somebody should have died, but didn't.
Yeah.
He was really proud of this fact, eventually ordering the Havana Museum to make a display of all the foiled attempts to kill him.
This is how you can build a cult of personality, by the way. Even the superpower America, you can fly to in less than an hour. Couldn't take me down. I mean, he was good at marketing himself.
Of the 15 years in jail he was supposed to serve for this raid, he only did 1.5 before Batista released him, in fear that he would look like too much of a dictator if he kept him locked up after elections.
Or make him a martyr.
Bad idea for him, because Fidel then fled to Mexico, announcing publicly he would come back one day with intention to get rid of this government.
The Cuban version of Douglas MacArthur.
In Mexico City, Fidel's brother Raul introduced him to a young doctor named Che Guevara. Raul and Che would be the more left-wing characters behind the revolution, and Fidel's personal relationship with them would be a huge factor in the revolution turning into a communist one.
Sure.
That revolution started when they sailed from Mexico back to Cuba.
You see how like the independence and the freedom of dictatorship from a dictatorship was the original motive. Now you have a vehicle of what to do once you achieve independence. How do you transition into a state for the people? That's where, the Marxism settles in for these guys. Again, similar to Vietnam as an example.
Famously botching the landing, almost dying again, nearly being captured by the army and fleeing into the Sierra Maestra Mountains to start a 2-year-long guerrilla war campaign. Batista reported that this rebel died several times throughout the war, but Castro would appear in interviews, radio programs, and a jeep touring around the country to gather up support and territory. 1 year in, the rebels captured Santiago, the country's second largest city, and on January 1st, 1959, Batista finally fled to the Dominican Republic, taking nearly all of the country's gold and dollar reserves with him and his goons. Even before he officially became president, everyone recognized Castro as the guy in charge of Cuba now. He was still adamant that this wasn't a communist movement, but 2 years later, just before the Bay of Pigs invasion, he finally declared himself a Marxist-Leninist in one of his marathon speeches.
Now, if you're like, oh, is that why they just initiated the Bay of Pigs invasion because of Cuba being declared socialist? No, the Bay of Pigs invasion was actually in the works for a long time, maybe years even. The people that end up fleeing during the Cuban Revolution probably would have sided with Batista. These people that are going to be exiled out are going to be sent back for a coup to take over the government. Of course, it fails. About Bay of Pigs invasion. It actually fails spectacularly.
It's not confirmed why he decided to join the League of Socialist Nations. It was probably a mix of his anti-Americanism, his own admiration for these revolutions, and, like many ex-members of his government have theorized, to get aid and weapons from the Soviets.
And there's been a history of the Soviet Union doing that. Right after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union are trying to kind of reform the world in their own image after the devastation of World War II. U.S. was doing it with newly independent African nations, trying to support coups and officials that would be favoring American economic investments, especially in Latin America. And the Soviet Union similarly, right? Newly independent countries trying to support them with strings attached. Of course, you got to be an ally of the Soviet Union and follow similar models. That was the world of the 50s and 60s.
Like that famous time they put missiles on his island and almost caused World War III, but really, he didn't want them there, and this did a lot to strain Cuban-Soviet relations.
Yeah, you go back to Castro on that, because when they're taken out, though, he was pretty furious about that. He thought that Khrushchev and the Soviets kind of just left Cuba hanging without anything that could help Cuba other than the United States had to, pinky swear that they would not try to take out Castro anymore. But what I understand, he was very upset of the fact that they ended up dismantling or removing the missiles as a part of the deal with JFK. But he didn't want them in the first place? I had not heard that before.
More helpful to him was a Soviet decision to buy all of Cuba's sugar supply for 7 times the world price, essentially subsidizing the government.
Makes sense that the Caribbean was built upon the sugar economy as brought in by Europeans that were colonizing the area for sugar production, and a massive amount of slave trade that had happened. Haiti was the largest. Cuba's going to be right up in there. It's actually where the highest percentages of African slaves ended up going to, was the Caribbean,
which they could use to buy Soviet oil and arms.
Right.
And
it's one of their few exports.
His government got more and more Soviet looking. Castro's agricultural agency, the INRA, radically redistributed land, even expropriating his own family's estates.
They also took over all the foreign investments and foreign installations there. So they seized a lot of American assets there, which actually we had a good conversation. If you guys were, what was it, probably last year, with Nick, the fat electrician, who we did a whole stream together, kind of talking about communism and everything, and kind of the history of it. And we talked about Cuba quite a bit, and asking him about ways to improve relations between the United States and Cuba, although they have improved. He was talking about how a key thing should be essentially reparations for the U.S. investments that were there in agriculture, factories, or anything like that. They were never compensated for that when they were taken over, when they were seized in the Cuban Revolution. What do you guys think about that? Are we beyond that point? Because you're talking about 60 years now, that should be a key part of fully normalizing relations with Cuba, essentially reparations to American investors.
Critical newspapers and TV stations were shut down. People who could threaten his rule were eliminated. And many people were arbitrarily detained. Even
it just sounds like it sounds like the other side of the coin from before, right? You have a Batista regime, big grievances about, secret police or whatever, and removing people not judiciously. Is it a little Animal Farmish?
Manuel Urrutia, who served as the first president after the revolution under the guise of being anti-revolution. When Fidel truly became Cuba's Maximo Líder, he would play a bigger role in what they called the moral economy. Of course, casinos and casino-adjacent industries were shut down, but American businesses were also kicked out with their assets seized.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands.
That's the big one. That was a lot, and that really, of course, is going to add extra problems of trying to have diplomatic relations. Because in the end, the U.S. government is going to support American capitalists and their investments. That drove the whole foreign policy of the Cold War.
Shut down, but American businesses were also kicked out with their assets seized. Tens of
for you guys that know a little bit more, why did they want to close down the casinos and I guess that kind of the nightlife? Because one of the things about Cuba was it had that incredible nightlife like in Havana. It was a big tourist destination. Americans loved going there. And tourism, could be an incredible thing for Cuba today as well. It could be one of the hot spots for Americans to go to, just like somewhere like in the Bahamas, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, all of these beautiful places in the Caribbean. That one I don't know as much about. Was it from a moral perspective? Was it supposed to be from that? For the gambling and the alcohol, I guess?
Thousands of small businesses were seized and nationalized. And people were pushed into where him and Shay wanted production to be.
These are a lot of the type of people that are going to end up fleeing Cuba, by the way. People that had this stuff seized, going to places like Florida.
Oftentimes, command economies reflect the personal preferences of their country's leaders, which can result in uneven development across the economy.
A command economy, which really is usually what people refer to when they say this state is a communist state, especially in the economic form. You're really talking about a command economy. And command economy is where the government makes the economic decisions. Soviet Union was doing that, especially with the Stalin era. Major economic decisions run by the party officials, aka the government.
A YouTube famous example was Fidel's program to create a super breed of milk cow because he personally loved dairy and ice cream.
That's right.
But a more
I covered that video.
Example would be that Cuba excelled in areas like healthcare and education, practically eliminating illiteracy and ending up with the highest percentage of doctors on Earth. Yet they lagged far behind in most sectors, especially.
That's usually the things they talk about the most, about the increase of literacy rates and that kind of thing, especially as compared to what things were like in the Batista regime. So you had, more doctors, more educated officials. But again, did that turn into better standards of living as compared to the time period before, right? Before the revolution? Probably depends on who you are, right? I mean, that's to the people that also left. So I guess you just have to ask who.
Doctors on Earth, yet they lagged far behind in most sectors, especially of consumer goods, even at times neglecting its own cash crop. Once, at the very start of this new government, they attempted to reduce the amount of land dedicated to growing sugar. But
this same thing happened after the Haitian Revolution. Haitian Revolution in the late 1800s was the slave rebellion, as it was the biggest slave colony out in the Caribbean, and France's biggest. That when they eventually get their independence from France, one thing the Haitians did have to do was pay reparations in significant numbers, enough where it's made Haiti poor from the get-go. But then also they did not, as they're creating their independent economy, keep up with the sugar production. And it's kind of understandable. I mean, some of these people had these brutal experiences with being enslaved in slave plantations. Among the worst things probably the worst thing you could do when it comes to slavery and what you're actually tasked to do, of the different types of work, that would have happened in the Americas, was sugar. It was incredibly dangerous. The working conditions were terrible. In Brazil, for example, 5 to 10% of slaves died, working. 1 in 10 died in sugar plantations. So those people not wanting to, even for, to their own profits in a way, I mean, call it PTSD or whatever it is, did not stay invested in the sugar production, which, looking back on it, would have been the economically probably best thing they could have done, especially because they got no financial aid and then, again, had to pay insane amounts of reparations back to France. Haiti never got out of its poverty.
Even Shea admitted that was a, quote, big mistake.
Gran error.
And a fetishistic idea.
Idea fetichista.
It's got a bad connotation to it.
Because they personally saw sugar as a symbol of American imperialism. So already we can see some reasons why the Cuban Communist Party has been able to last so much longer than the Soviets.
Yeah, but it's, seizing the means of production. That was such an ample opportunity for the Haitians, as well as the Cubans. But, I mean, at least you can understand, or at least there was an explanation, doesn't mean it was a good one, but it's an explanation.
So already we can see some reasons why the Cuban Communist Party has been able to last so much longer than the Soviets. It was a self-made, rather than Russian-imposed revolution to get rid of an insanely unpopular government. Fidel was very...
Well, so was the Russian monarchy. Although there was, plenty of people that are going to end up fighting when you have the Reds versus the Whites. But the Russian Revolution definitely had its critics of the previous regime.
Very personally popular, and it was isolated from the rest of the Eastern Bloc. But 2 other reasons both have to do with this country: embargoes and emigration. Fidel Castro, unlike many other communist leaders, would allow waves of disaffected Cubans to leave the country. Where? Who knows? He didn't care. They weren't his Cubans. This kind of acted like a pressure release valve, so that the most angry citizens could direct their energy into fleeing rather than trying to take down the government.
I guess that's, in a way, like a better idea. If people don't like you just let them leave on their own. Prevent some kind of uprising. I mean, it worked for the Soviet bloc for, a long time, keeping East Germans from going to the West. At least able to hold on to it for a few decades. But in the end, that ends up being a problem.
Decade after the revolution, an estimated 400,000 people left the island. One wave in 1980 saw 125,000 people leave in boats, rafts, and tubes from Mariel Harbor.
Interested to know if you guys know, how is that similar as a percentage to East Germans that left to West Germany? Someone do the math for me. Let me know in the comments.
Castro even forced many prisoners to join this exodus, proving he really did think throwing his undesirables away was a good strategy to keep Cuba pure. Many of them went to Spanish-speaking countries,
like it, yeah.
But most went to the U.S., and in particular, Florida. The biggest wave has actually been since 2020, when the Nicaraguan government loosened visa requirements for Cubans. 500,000 came to the U.S., mostly up through Central America, crossing the Mexican border.
Yep.
After the capture of Havana...
As is similar with a lot of Latin American immigrants coming from Central America.
Through Central America, crossing the Mexican border. After the capture of Havana in 1959, entire layers of the old Cuban elite fled to Florida, laying the foundations for what would become modern Miami. Before that, Tampa was the hub of Florida. Can you believe that?
Right?
Tampa? American governments welcomed these refugees, with the county giving them $35 million, then $72 million in the first 2 years after the revolution, and the federal government passing the Cuban Adjustment Act in 1966, which allowed Cuban immigrants to apply for citizenship after only 1 year of living in America.
Can you imagine if that was a policy these days? That would never happen in the U.S. with the current rhetoric. Do you think them fleeing a communist country also was something as like a badge of honor? That processing these immigrants, faster was sort of scoring points in the ideological battle that was the Cold War, and probably
giving them a special sort of status that lasted throughout the Cold War. One of the things most of the immigrants can agree on is that the American government should promote regime change in Cuba. Every demographic, even American-born Cubans, supports this idea. The American government's official policy is to embargo Cuba, blocking trade of most goods to the island.
And that was very economically damaging. I mean, you saw early on with Castro, it was like, yo, you want to buy some iron and stuff? Or, you want to buy some stuff? Would have been a huge benefit to Cuba to have that type of economic tie to the U.S., but didn't.
According to the Cuban government, causing over $150 billion in losses. The only things America officially trades with the island are food, medicine, and humanitarian goods.
And again, could one of the ideas have been compensation for the American investment assets? Do that, and then you can have an economic relationship. Think that would have been a fair thing?
Everything else shouldn't have a Made in the USA sticker on it. Yet most Cuban Americans also believe the U.S. hasn't done enough. I mean, the embargo's gone on for over 6 decades.
Plenty.
You'd think it would work by now if decreasing the island's material standard of living would actually make people want to overthrow their government.
That never happens. Those embargoes, sanctions, they don't really create regime change. You've seen the United States has tried that in Iran. They've done it in North Korea. What ends up happening is the state just doubles down on itself, and it's used as fodder to fuel anti-American sentiment in places like that.
And this is one of the reasons why Cuban Americans are, on average, so Republican.
Yeah. They vote as far away from anything that might look like socialism, in a higher block than any Latin American demographic by far. And why Florida has routinely voted Republican. For a major urban state like that, you would think it would probably go the way of the bi-coastal elite nations, that generally vote blue. I remember that song.
Nearly 70% of Cubans did, in fact, vote for Donald Trump in 2024. Cuban Americans are at their peak of political power, with people like Marco Rubio playing a key role in America's latest right-wing revolution. He happens to be the highest-ranking Secretary of State since Henry Kissinger. You can guess his personal opinions on Cuba's communist government.
Wait, highest-ranking Secretary of State? There's different ranks of Secretaries of State? What do you mean?
2.
And he was going to start.
Guess his personal opinions on Cuba's communist government, too.
And he was going to start this group to go on college campuses and try to convince young Americans that ours is the greatest country in the history of the world and that Marxism was bad. I'm going to admit to you guys, I was a little skeptical. I said, college campuses, you're going to do that? Why don't you start somewhere easier, like, for example, Communist Cuba, you know?
And Fidel Castro's own daughter is an anti-communist radio host in Miami. His grandson is actually an influencer of his own back home, but he's a little more of a stereotypical trust fund kid.
Yeah, I was gonna say, this looks corny. So corny. Oh, he's just creating a persona for clicks, huh?
La disquera se va a llamar Castro Record. ¿Cómo? Castro Record.
If a trust fund was actually a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Exactly.
Or something. One of the reasons people like Sandro can live the life he does is through remittances, money sent back home. Over 90% of Cuban remittance senders live in America, sending an average of around $2,400 per year. Since America has capped legal remittances to only $300 every 3 months, most are actually sent through informal money mules.
They don't want money going into Cuba beneficially because people have left it and they're like wanting them to, you know, improve their family members' lives back home, or maybe try to help them finance from the inside there. Maybe a move to the U.S.
Dollars every 3 months, most are actually sent through informal money mules who just transport the physical cash over the Strait of Florida. About 70% of Cubans receive remittances, relying on them to buy goods and even operate their businesses, where businesses can be operated. If you're truly an elite Cuban, you just operate your business in Miami. Around the 70s and 80s, the city truly became global when it hit over 1 million people. One of the reasons why is because it's been an oasis of peace in an otherwise unstable region. That is, if you consider Miami part of Latin America.
You don't. Unless it transformed into that, and I just don't think so.
Which, considering over 70% of the city speaks Spanish, you can make a good case for. Nearly half of American trade with Latin America and the Caribbean
Maybe I need to hear a better argument.
Miami's Biscayne Bay. It's the Latin American capital of banking and finance, and through successive waves of migration, over a third of Miami-Dade County is now Cuban.
True.
Entire sections of the city.
You just have to say that if they're propping up the economies of these other places. I don't know if you can really argue that, can you? Are they really propping up the economy of the Latin American world?
It looked like they were copy-pasted from the island. Little Havana, of course, but also places like Westchester, Coral Terrace, and Hialeah, which, according to my Miami accomplice Rick Ross, celebrated when Fidel died.
Hialeah celebrated when Fidel died. Patty LaBelle, who knew this?
As dumb as it might sound, Rick Ross is honestly a good symbol of Miami culture, which has been heavily shaped by opposition to communist rule. Through and through, Miamians are hustlers.
I now own a casino. I repeat.
What you're looking at right now is the next chapter in the cosmos.
You go to Home Depot and you go get me the biggest install there is with a big chain. I'm gonna cut the trees down.
Being the first to embrace the newest economic conventions in America.
Cruz putting the final touches on the Bitcoin 2021 convention. The world.
Oh my God, Bitcoin is like, crypto is just like taking over Florida. It could. I'm afraid it could crash Florida because that so much of that stuff is crashing.
World's largest cryptocurrency conference.
Even being a potential competitor to Wall Street.
Now, having said that, Miami, I think, represents the future of America. And I really do believe there are very important lessons for America from the good governance that you see here in the state of Florida.
Referring to tax laws, Florida, great place for that.
Florida.
I'm sure the large Cuban population,
in certain aspects, you're going to pay more enough for other things, though.
Government forces have played a role in enabling Miami to be the hyper-capitalist city it is today. But if you look back at modern-day Cuba, and I know people have been predicting the collapse of the regime since 1991, it really does look extra shaky these days. Although Fidel grew old and frail, his larger-than-life personality kept the revolution going, although with less and less enthusiasm as the decades went on. Then, when health problems got too much for him, Raul Castro stepped in, opening up a little with public grumbles from his brother, until the first non-Castro took charge in 2021. By then, the vast majority of Cubans had no memory of life before the revolution, and the only leaders they knew were Castro's.
You know, that's an important thing, because one thing we have seen in states like that, like China had this, Soviet Union had this, which was when you purely were getting to generation 2. You didn't live through like maybe the glorious days. You know, this is something Mao was referring to when they did the Cultural Revolution. You know, morale is very bad, especially from the failures of the Great Leap Forward. But, you know, they had feared that this new young population didn't get to, you know, experience the pride that came with the revolution. And if you know what happens in the 60s there in China, they basically do that. They supercharge the youth into communist ideology to kind of, again, really try to excite the young generation. You know, you got to be fearful of that. Same with anybody. I mean, anybody that's afraid the next generation is, you know, going to not learn what the great parts of your past. You try to create movements to do that.
President Miguel Diaz-Canel's administration has gone through a bit of a privatization period after the pandemic, with small businesses now employing more than the government. Though economic power just ended up concentrated in the military's hands. An arm of the military, GISA, which stands for, get this, Business Administration Group Inc., is estimated to control about 37% of Cuba's production.
What is what's the goal of the militarism of Cuba? Are they fearful of like an invasion? Or is it more like a police force?
Most importantly, its resorts and hotels, but also much of its transportation networks, gas stations, supermarkets, real estate, construction, banks, and foreign exchange, aka the remittance industry. A report by the Miami Herald suggested GISA held around $18 billion in assets.
Ooh, so they're taking remittances? They're like, it's going to the state, not to the families. Is that what we're saying here?
Making it far, far more solvent than the Cuban government itself. Or, as another way to look at it, making triple the income of the state. I didn't realize
remittances were still...
This group can't be held accountable by the Cuban government. It's almost as if a parallel state is forming under a different set of rules, one the country can't monitor.
Dude, this would be like the British East India Company. Eventually just trying to compete with the British crown. You got your own fighting force, like they did.
Meanwhile, the starved Cuban state is going through the worst crisis in probably its entire history. Since 2021, 20% of the entire island has left the country. That's an unprecedented migration, even by Cuban standards. And it hollowed the country out of workers, as many skilled Cubans either left or went into more easily adjustable paying jobs like driving taxis or working on resorts for tourists.
That's the bad thing. I think we talked about this with Nick, the fat electrician, too, about, you know, the pay for that and how it wasn't, their doctors just not paid that much. So they go to other places where they can be doctors. And because, you know, in so many countries, and doctors are some of the, you know, best paid professions out there. Now, those demographics do sound interesting from like what you saw in Berlin, you know, before the wall went up, how high skilled professionals were moving to West Berlin because they could get paid better and have more opportunities to use those professional skills. Likely one of the reasons why they in the East, they ended that migration, why they ended the free movement between the Germanys. It's one thing to lose your political dissenters, but it's another one for your professionals. Can't let them lose, or can't allow them to leave.
At the same time, the end of the dual currency system, which let Cubans use either Cuban pesos or US dollars, they usually chose dollars, devalued its currency sharply, leading to an insane price increase in imported goods.
Well, like, devaluing your currency could be good if you had all this foreign investment. That's why China does it repeatedly. because the buying power is so great for Chinese goods because of their devaluing of their currency. They do that intentionally to stay competitive in the global markets. But Cuba isn't doing that like China is. World isn't going out and buying Cuban goods and outsourcing to China like so much of the rest of the dominant economic world is. So that's scary to do.
Food and fuel. The government officially reported an inflation rate of 200% in 2023, but some estimates put it as high as 500%. And to top it all off, their oil line to Venezuela has dried up, leaving the country literally starved of fuel.
Why? Is it because they're devalued their money? They can't afford it? Venezuela's like, yo, your money's worthless.
Daily blackouts are a common occurrence. Pork, rice, and bean production have halved. Hospitals ran out of supplies. 7 out of 10 Cubans are reported to skip meals. Bicycles and horse carts have become more useful than cars in the countryside. And tourism, the one saving grace, hasn't recovered since COVID. In an ironic twist, Cuba has actually started importing sugar because its ability to produce it has fallen so dramatically.
It's Cuba over. Man, that ends up, it's coming back to haunt them again, huh? Now even decades later, more directly, when your whole country's economy was made profitable from sugar at a time, and then you don't continue that investment. It's obviously a missed opportunity that way, but we've already discussed that.
Maybe Mexico will step in to carry out their fuel needs, but definitely not the world's largest oil producer. And certainly not while little Marco is Secretary of State. Only 8% of Cubans actually see America's embargo.
Like that long before Marco Rubio was the Secretary of State. I mean, he was in Congress, before, and it'll continue after the Trump administration's over.
As the main cause for state breakdown. While mass protests directed at their own government have broken out since 2021, at the extremes, calling for the end of it. That could be the finale of the two-Cuba system, but it could also come from the American side, particularly with the back and forth flip-flopping over Cubans' special protections in the U.S.
Do you think the type of coups, though, that we did see during much of the Cold War, like the U.S. is not nearly as invested in doing things like that like they used to be? It seems more likely now that it's going to have to come internally and truly internally, not the fake way where the U.S. would try to quietly fund or train insurgents inside of a country, support the revolutionaries in there, but like fully grassroots.
Between the American administrations, Cubans can expect to be granted into the U.S. on a humanitarian basis or not, depending on if the government is red or blue, and the same thing for normalizing relations or designating Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. The current color wants a total pressure embargo, and some Miami exiles want a total ban on travel and remittances to the country.
But again, we just see repeatedly from history that doesn't promote regime change. I don't know, unless you want to pull up some examples of some of the most infamous cases, though.
The special provisions allowing many Cubans into the U.S. were, flipped, making them susceptible to deportation.
Right.
And yet, the Cuban government refuses to take any exiles
back. Not the time for
kicking
importation
Cubans out
right now.
Refusing to accept Cuban migrants could ironically do more damage to the Cuban government than the genuine attempts America has been trying for decades. But at the risk of killing the second Cuba in South Florida.
The U.S. has had more success with, doing coups than regime change through sanctions.
Subscribe. If you don't, I'll kill you. And watch this.
By the way, this Liberia video, I covered that, was very good. Check that out. I'll try to link that here with the ending credits, okay? That one's really good. Okay, final thoughts. Well, the thing I think I like most was kind of checking back in with Cuba. I feel like I've had kind of a blind spot, probably since the most, recent president. So at least since 2018, the last about 6 years. And it definitely, at least from his metrics that he was showing, things getting worse. So again, where is the bottom? And what happens when you get to the bottom, if it does happen there? Is it some kind of revolution that way? But you've seen how well funded now the military is. They were talking about how the military holds incredible amount of wealth, even more than the actual apparently GDP of the country. But so that would make things, even more difficult. Or are we going to see more of an exodus? Now, again, one of the problems, of course, is right now is the worst time for immigration to the United States as it's ever been, right? Things are shut off and people are getting sent back by the thousands with goals of millions, even by the end of the Trump administration. So, what happens to the people there? Are they stuck? Or is there going to be another destination? Because other countries are going to have similar things. They're not going to want to see big waves of immigrants. And we've already seen that from other countries. All right, anyways, lots to think about. I know I said a lot along the way. What do you guys think? See you next time.